In the heart of Atlanta's bustling First Trust Bank, a retired nurse named Eleanor Harris steps forward with a simple question about mysterious fees draining her savings. Met with scorn from a smug manager, her plea for fairness seems destined to be ignored, until an unexpected voice thunders through the crowd. What begins as one woman's fight spirals into a battle that captivates a city, fueled by a boxing legend's stand for justice and a viral video that shakes the system. Will Eleanor reclaim her dignity, or will the bank's walls hold firm? Dive into a story of courage, confrontation, and change. Below is the English translation of the provided text. In the midst of the crowd, Eleanor Harris stood quietly, her hands tightly clutching a white envelope. At 75, she still carried the dignified air of someone who had been a nurse for 4 decades. Her hair, almost entirely silver, was neatly tied back, and her deep brown eyes shone with resolve, though they sometimes betrayed a hint of weariness. Eleanor wore a navy blue sweater and a simple long skirt, her low-heeled shoes worn but clean. The envelope in her hands contained a bank statement and a letter, items she had carefully prepared that morning after discovering something unusual in her account. Eleanor wasn't fond of visiting the bank. The place always made her feel out of place, with its sleek computer screens and young employees who spoke in a jargon-filled language she struggled to follow. But today she had no choice. For the past 3 months, her account had been deducted $50 each month with a vague note. Account maintenance fee. For someone living on a fixed pension, $150 was a significant amount, enough to cover groceries for a week, pay the electricity bill, or even buy a birthday gift for her grandson Jamal. Eleanor had called the customer service hotline, but all she got were evasive answers. Finally, she decided to go to the bank in person to get answers. The line moved sluggishly, and Eleanor could sense the impatience of those around her. A middle-aged man in a crumpled shirt muttered about the long wait. A young woman pushing a stroller tried to soothe her crying baby. Eleanor stood still, her hands gripping the envelope, her gaze fixed on the counter ahead. She tried to ignore the faint ache in her knees, a lingering consequence of years spent standing during hospital shifts, and reassured herself that as long as she stayed calm, everything would be fine. Finally, it was her turn. The employee behind the counter was a young woman in her early 20s, with blonde hair tied up high and a name tag that read Kayla Thompson. Kayla looked exhausted, her eyes shadowed as if she'd been working nonstop all day. She looked up at Eleanor and offered a strained smile. "Hello, ma'am, how can I help you?" Eleanor took a deep breath, striving to keep her voice calm but clear. "Hello, my name is Eleanor Harris. I'm here because there are some charges on my account I don't understand. I'd like to check if there's been a mistake." Kayla nodded, but her eyes were already on her computer screen, as if she were operating on autopilot. "Can you show me the documents, please?" Eleanor placed the envelope on the counter, carefully opening it to retrieve the statement and letter. "These are my account statements. For the past 3 months, I've been charged $50 each month for something called a maintenance fee. But I've had this account for over 40 years and never seen this fee before." Kayla took the papers, glancing over them cursorily. She typed something on her keyboard, then frowned. Let me see. This could be a standard fee for accounts that don't meet the minimum balance. Do you keep a balance above $2,000, ma'am?" Eleanor felt a flush of heat in her chest, but she kept her voice steady. "My account has always been stable. I don't spend recklessly, and I was never notified of any policy changes. Could you look into it more thoroughly, please?" Kayla hesitated, her eyes darting around as if seeking help. She typed a few more keys, but her expression grew increasingly confused. I'm not sure. The system says this fee was applied starting 3 months ago. Maybe it's due to a policy change. I don't handle that." Eleanor felt frustration rising, but she clung to her patience. "I understand, but I need to know exactly why this fee appeared. I didn't receive any notice, and this money matters to me." Before Kayla could respond, a deep, sharp voice cut in from behind the counter. "What's going on here?" A middle-aged man in a gray suit approached. His name tag read, Richard Baxter, branch manager. Richard had a lean face, small, piercing eyes, and the way he stood, hands in pockets, shoulders slightly raised, exuded a confidence bordering on arrogance. Kayla turned to him, her voice tinged with relief as if a burden had been lifted. "Mr. Baxter, Mrs. Harris is asking about some fees on her account. I'm checking, but Richard glanced at Eleanor, his eyes scanning her from head to toe as if appraising an item. Without letting Kayla finish, he interrupted. What fees? Let me see. He snatched the statement from Kayla's hand, skimmed it in less than 3 seconds, and tossed it back onto the counter. This is a standard account maintenance fee. If you don't meet the minimum balance requirement, the system automatically applies it. Very simple. Eleanor felt her cheeks burn, but she kept her voice calm. I understand, sir, but I've never seen this fee before. I've been a customer of this bank since the 1980s. If there was a change, I should have been notified. Richard sighed, a dramatic sound that drew the attention of a few people in line. He crossed his arms, giving a faint smile. Mrs. Harris, is it? The bank has the right to update its policies, and we can't send handwritten letters to every customer. If you read the fine print in your contract, it's all clearly stated. Eleanor gripped the envelope tightly, her fingers trembling slightly. She wasn't one to anger easily, but Richard's tone, as if she were a child who didn't understand, felt deeply insulting. I don't need a handwritten letter, she said, her voice rising slightly. But I deserve a clear explanation. This money affects my life. Richard raised an eyebrow, his smile turning cold. If the fees are too much for you, perhaps you should consider a more basic account. Or, he paused, his tone carrying a hint of mockery, another bank. A few people in line chuckled. Eleanor felt her face flush, as if the entire room were staring at her. She glanced around, hoping for a sympathetic look, but most people were looking down, scrolling on their phones, or pretending not to hear. Kayla stood frozen, her eyes fixed on her keyboard, as if she wanted to disappear. Eleanor took a deep breath, trying to steady the trembling in her hands. She had faced worse situations than this. Days as a nurse in the hospital, when doctors or patients dismissed her because of her skin color or gender. But today, standing at this bank counter, she felt smaller than ever. Still, she knew she couldn't leave without answers. I'm not going anywhere, she said, her voice low but firm. Not until I understand why my money's disappearing. Richard shrugged, a flicker of irritation in his eyes. Suit yourself, he said, then turned to Kayla. Handle it quickly. There are others waiting. Eleanor stood there clutching the envelope, her heart pounding. She didn't know how far she could push this, but she knew she wouldn't let them dismiss her any longer. Richard Baxter's voice still echoed in her head. Suit yourself. Cold and laced with contempt, as if she were just a minor nuisance to be swept aside. The air in First Trust Bank seemed to grow heavier, Kayla's typing blending with the murmurs from the line behind her. Eleanor felt their eyes, some curious, some annoyed, but most indifferent. She took a deep breath, trying to quell the trembling in her chest. She wasn't about to let Richard win, but with every passing second, she felt more and more like she was fighting alone. Kayla, still behind the counter, fumbled with a few more keystrokes, her eyes avoiding Eleanor's. I'm checking again, Mrs. Harris, she said, her voice so soft it was nearly drowned out by the ringing phone at the next counter. But like Mr. Baxter said, it might be a new policy. I'm not sure. Not sure? Eleanor cut in, her voice rising slightly, though she maintained her composure. Young lady, I've been a customer of this bank since before you were born. 42 years, and I've never seen a fee like this. If it's a new policy, why wasn't I notified? I deserve to know. Kayla opened her mouth, but before she could respond, Richard Baxter strode back, his polished leather shoes clicking sharply on the tiled floor. He crossed his arms, his gaze sweeping over Eleanor as if she were a simple puzzle he'd already solved. Mrs. Harris, I've already explained, he said, his tone even but tinged with theatrical flair, clearly meant for the whole room to hear. This is a standard fee. If you can't read the fine print in your contract, that's not our fault. Eleanor felt the blood rush to her face, a burning heat spreading from her cheeks to her neck. She was no stranger to this kind of talk, the way people used words to make her feel small, inferior. She remembered her days as a nurse at Morehouse Hospital in the 1960s, when some white doctors would smile politely but call her names like girl or helper, despite her being a fully trained nurse. But today, standing before Richard Baxter, she wasn't that young woman anymore. She was Eleanor Harris, who had cared for hundreds of patients, raised a daughter, and survived days when the world didn't want her to hold her head high. She wouldn't let him belittle her. "I've read the contract," she said, her voice slow but firm. She opened her envelope and pulled out a carefully folded piece of paper, a copy of her account agreement from 10 years ago. "This is what I signed. There's not a single line about a $50 monthly fee. If something's changed, I need to see proof." Richard raised an eyebrow, a faint smirk curling his lips. He took the paper, glancing at it as if it were a child's toy, then tossed it back onto the counter. "Mrs. Harris, that contract is outdated. The bank updates its policies every year. If you want to avoid the fee, maintain the minimum balance, $2,000, as Kayla mentioned. It's very simple." He paused, his tone growing more sardonic. "Or is that something you can't afford to do?" A chuckle sounded from somewhere in the line. Eleanor turned, her eyes scanning the crowd. A man in a polo shirt was covering his mouth, trying to hide a grin. A young woman scrolled on her phone, pretending not to hear. But no one met her gaze. No one spoke up. Eleanor felt her throat tighten, as if the air in the room were being sucked away. She was no stranger to this feeling, the sense of being made invisible, as if her story, her life, didn't matter to anyone. "I'm not here to be mocked," she said, her voice trembling slightly but still resolute. "I just want fairness. This money is my blood and sweat. I worked my whole life for it, and I won't let you take it without an explanation." Richard sighed, a long, dramatic sound, as if she were wasting his precious time. He leaned over the counter, his voice loud enough for the room to hear. "Mrs. Harris, if you can't meet this bank's requirements, maybe you should find somewhere more suitable. There are community banks for people like you." People like you. The words hit like a blade, sharp and deliberate. Eleanor felt her heart pound, blood rushing to her ears. She knew what he meant, not just about money, but about who she was. An older black woman living on a pension, not the VIP customer the bank cared to keep. She'd heard variations of that phrase her whole life, but each time it stung like the first. Kayla, standing beside him, finally spoke, her voice small and hesitant. "Mr. Baxter, maybe I could check the system again. It could be a mistake." Richard shot her a glance, his eyes sharp as knives. "Miss Thompson, you've already checked. The system doesn't make mistakes, does it?" His tone carried a subtle threat, making Kayla lower her head, her fingers freezing on the keyboard. Eleanor felt a surge of anger flare in her chest, but she reined it in, channeling it into resolve. She straightened her back, looking directly into Richard's eyes. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice low but hard as steel. "Not until I get a real answer." Richard let out a short, hollow laugh. He crossed his arms, shaking his head as if she were a stubborn child. "You want to stand here all day? Suit yourself. But I have dozens of other customers to serve. People who actually understand how a bank works." He turned to Kayla, barking an order. "Call the next person." The murmurs in the line grew louder. A man behind her grumbled, "Why's this taking so long?" Another woman sighed, "I just want to get home." Eleanor felt their stares pressing into her back, as if she were the cause of their inconvenience. She looked down at the envelope in her hands, her trembling fingers leaving creases in the paper. She thought of her daughter, Vivian, who always said she was too stubborn. She thought of her grandson Jamal, whom she'd promised new basketball shoes for his birthday. The $150 wasn't just a number, it was meals, moments, her dignity. She opened her mouth, about to say something more, but her voice caught in her throat. She felt herself shrinking, as if the room were swallowing her whole. She'd fought so many battles in her life, but this time, she wasn't sure she had the strength left. Then from the back of the line, a deep, resonant voice cut through the air, powerful as a punch. "Why are you talking to her like that?" Every sound in the bank stopped. Kayla's typing ceased. The crowd's whispers faded. Eleanor turned, her heart pounding. A man stood at the end of the line, tall, wearing a black t-shirt and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. She couldn't see him clearly, but his voice, deep, steady, and commanding, made the entire room freeze. Richard spun around, his eyes narrowing. "Excuse me, what did you say?" The man took a step forward, his voice unwavering. "I said, why are you talking to her like that?" The air in the First Trust Bank froze, as if the entire room had collectively held its breath. Eleanor Harris stood rooted to the spot, her fingers still clutching the crumpled envelope, her heart pounding from the sting of Richard Baxter's words. The murmurs of the crowd, the clatter of keyboards, the restless shifting of feet, all had stopped, silenced by the deep, commanding voice that had cut through the tension like a blade. "Why are you talking to her like that?" the man repeated, his tone steady but laced with an edge that made the hairs on Eleanor's neck stand up. Richard Baxter turned slowly, his polished shoes squeaking faintly against the tiled floor. His eyes narrowed, irritation flashing across his face as he sized up the stranger at the back of the line. "Excuse me?" he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "This is a private matter between the bank and a customer. I don't know who you are, but—" "Then let me make it clear," the man interrupted, stepping forward. The crowd parted instinctively, heads turning to follow him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed simply in a black t-shirt and jeans, a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. At first glance, he could have been any frustrated customer, but there was something about the way he moved, deliberate, unyielding, that commanded attention. He stopped a few feet from the counter, his presence filling the space like a storm cloud rolling in. "I'm someone who doesn't like seeing a lady disrespected, so I'm asking again, why are you talking to her like that?" Eleanor blinked, her gaze shifting from Richard to the stranger. She couldn't see his face clearly under the shadow of the cap, but his voice carried a weight that made her feel, for the first time that day, like she wasn't entirely alone. The room remained silent, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning and the occasional beep from a computer. Kayla, still standing behind the counter, gripped the edge of her keyboard, her knuckles pale. Even she seemed to sense that something was about to change. Richard straightened, smoothing the lapels of his suit jacket as if to reassert control. "Sir," he said, his smile tight and practiced, "I appreciate your concern, but this is bank business. If you have an issue, you're welcome to take a number and wait your turn." The man tilted his head slightly, and for a moment Eleanor thought she saw a flicker of amusement cross his shadowed face. Then with a slow, deliberate motion, he reached up and pulled off his cap. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Whispers erupted like sparks catching fire. "Oh my God, is that? No way, it's him! Mike Tyson?" Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Standing before her was indeed Mike Tyson, the heavyweight boxing legend, the man whose name was synonymous with raw power and unrelenting grit. His face, weathered but unmistakable, carried the scars of a life lived in and out of the ring. His eyes, dark and piercing, locked onto Richard with an intensity that made the bank manager flinch. The whispers grew louder, phones were subtly raised to snap photos, and the atmosphere shifted from tense to electric. Richard's confident facade faltered, his lips parting as if to speak but finding no words. "Mr. Tyson," he finally stammered, his voice a pitch higher than before. I didn't realize..." "Didn't realize what?" Mike cut him off, his voice calm but firm, each word landing like a jab. "That someone might call you out for treating this lady like she's nothing? Or that you're picking on someone who's just asking for what's right?" Eleanor felt her cheeks warm, a mix of gratitude and disbelief washing over her. She had seen Mike Tyson on television, his fights, his interviews, his larger-than-life presence. But never in her wildest dreams did she imagine he'd be standing here, in a bank in Atlanta, speaking up for her. She tightened her grip on the envelope, her hands no longer trembling, and watched as Mike turned his attention to her. "Ma'am," he said, his tone softening, his eyes meeting hers with a warmth that caught her off guard. "Can you tell me what's going on? What's the problem here?" For a moment, Eleanor hesitated, the weight of the room's attention pressing down on her. But Mike's gaze was steady, encouraging, like a lifeline in a storm. She took a deep breath, her voice finding its strength. "My name is Eleanor Harris," she began, holding up the envelope. "I've been a customer here for over 40 years. 3 months ago, they started taking $50 out of my account every month, fees I've never seen before. I came to ask why, but..." She paused, glancing at Richard, who was now visibly sweating. "All I've gotten is excuses and insults." Mike nodded slowly, his expression unreadable as he took the envelope from her outstretched hand. He opened it carefully, his thick fingers surprisingly gentle as he pulled out the bank statements and scanned them. The room watched in silence, the only sound the rustle of paper and the occasional click of a phone camera. After a few seconds, he looked up, his eyes narrowing as they fixed on Richard. $50 a month, Mike said, holding up the statement. For 3 months. No notice. No explanation. And you're telling her it's her fault for not reading the fine print? His voice was low, but it carried a dangerous undercurrent, like the rumble before a knockout punch. Richard cleared his throat, his hands fidgeting at his sides. Mr. Tyson, it's not that simple. Our policies... Policies? Mike interrupted, stepping closer to the counter. The crowd leaned in, sensing the shift. You want to talk policies? Fine. Explain to me why a woman who's been banking here for decades, is suddenly hit with fees she wasn't told about. Explain why, when she asks a simple question, you treat her like she's wasting your time. Richard opened his mouth then closed it again, his face reddening. Kayla shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting between her boss and the boxing legend. The crowd was no longer silent. Murmurs of agreement began to ripple through the line. A middle-aged man in a delivery uniform nodded, muttering, "That's right." A young woman with a baby on her hip whispered to the person next to her, "I got hit with fees too." Eleanor felt a spark of hope ignite in her chest, fragile but growing. For the first time since she'd walked into the bank, she didn't feel like she was fighting alone. Mike's presence was like a shield, his words giving voice to the frustration she'd been carrying. She stood a little taller, her shoulders squaring as she watched Richard squirm. "Mr. Tyson," Richard said, forcing a smile that looked more like a grimace, "I assure you, we follow strict guidelines. These fees are standard for accounts that don't meet the minimum balance. If Mrs. Harris can't maintain... Mike's voice rose slightly, cutting through Richard's excuse like a blade. He turned to Eleanor, his expression softening again. "Ma'am, how long did you say you've been with this bank?" 42 years, Eleanor replied, her voice steady now, bolstered by the unexpected ally before her. "Since I opened my first savings account when I started working as a nurse." Mike nodded, then turned back to Richard, his eyes narrowing. 42 years. That's loyalty most businesses would kill for. And you're standing here telling her she's not good enough because she doesn't have a couple grand sitting in her account? He shook his head, a low chuckle escaping his lips, though there was no humor in it. "Man, you've got some nerve." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, more distinct. "That's messed up," someone said. "They did the same thing to my mom," another voice added. Eleanor glanced around, noticing the shift in the room. Faces that had been indifferent moments ago were now watching intently, some with furrowed brows, others with nods of agreement. A young man near the front of the line pulled out his phone, holding it up as if to record. Richard's face was now a deep shade of crimson, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. "Mr. Tyson, with all due respect, you don't understand how banking works. These fees are automated, part of our system. Then pull up her account," Mike said, his voice calm but unyielding. He leaned forward slightly, resting one hand on the counter, his presence towering over Richard. "Right now, let's see this system of yours, because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're hiding something." Kayla's eyes widened, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Richard shot her a glare, but she didn't move, caught between her boss's authority and the undeniable force of Mike Tyson's demand. The crowd held its breath, phones raised higher, waiting for what would happen next. Eleanor stood still, her heart racing, but her resolve unbroken. For the first time that day, she felt the tide turning, and Mike Tyson was the one steering it. The First Trust Bank felt like a pressure cooker on the verge of exploding. The air was thick with anticipation, every eye in the room locked on the standoff unfolding at the counter. Mike Tyson stood tall, one hand resting on the polished surface, his gaze pinning Richard Baxter like a fighter sizing up an opponent in the ring. Eleanor Harris stood beside him, her heart pounding but her posture steady, the crumpled envelope in her hands now a symbol of her refusal to back down. Kayla Thompson hovered behind the counter, her fingers trembling over the keyboard, caught in the crossfire of Mike's demand and Richard's glare. The crowd, once a restless sea of indifference, was now a chorus of murmurs and raised phones, their attention fully captured. "Pull it up," Mike repeated, his voice low and unyielding. "Show us her account. If your system's so perfect, let's see it." Richard's face was a mask of barely contained panic, his jaw tight as he tried to regain control. Sweat glistened on his forehead, catching the fluorescent light above. "Mr. Tyson," he said, forcing a smile that looked more like a grimace, "this isn't necessary. We can handle this privately. Privately? Mike cut him off, his tone sharp enough to make Richard flinch. He gestured toward Eleanor, his eyes never leaving the manager's face. You didn't have a problem embarrassing this lady in front of everyone? Now you want to talk private? Nah, we're doing this right here, right now. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Yeah, let's see it! A young man in a hoodie called out, his phone held high, the red recording light blinking. Others nodded, their voices growing bolder. Show us the account! A woman with a toddler on her hip added, her frustration mirroring Eleanor's. The room was no longer a passive backdrop. It was alive, feeding off Mike's energy and Eleanor's quiet resolve. Eleanor felt a warmth spread through her chest, a fragile hope taking root. For the first time since she'd stepped into the bank, she didn't feel like she was shouting into a void. Mike's presence was like a beacon, drawing others into her fight. She glanced at him, catching the faintest nod of encouragement in his eyes, and it steadied her. She'd spent years standing up for herself, against dismissive doctors, prejudiced neighbors, a world that often tried to shrink her. But today, she wasn't alone. Richard's hands twitched at his sides, his polished demeanor crumbling under the weight of the room's scrutiny. He shot a glance at Kayla, his voice low and edged with desperation. Thompson, do it. Pull up the account. Kayla hesitated, her eyes darting to Eleanor, then to Mike, then back to her screen. Her fingers moved slowly at first, as if she were afraid of what she might find. The soft clatter of the keyboard filled the silence, each keystroke amplifying the tension. The crowd leaned in, phones raised higher, capturing every moment. Eleanor held her breath, her fingers tightening around the envelope until her knuckles ached. The screen flickered and Kayla's eyes widened as the account details loaded. She scanned the information, her lips parting slightly. Mrs. Harris's account, she began, her voice shaky. It shows the fees started 3 months ago. $50 each month, labeled as maintenance fees. But, she paused, her brow furrowing as she scrolled further. But what? Mike prompted, leaning forward slightly, his voice calm but insistent. Kayla swallowed, glancing nervously at Richard. There's no record of a notification being sent to her. The system should have flagged her account for a courtesy notice, especially since she's been a customer for so long. And she hesitated, her voice dropping. It looks like the fees were applied after a policy change that targeted accounts with balances under $2,000. A low gasp rippled through the crowd. Eleanor's heart sank, not from surprise but from confirmation. She'd suspected something was wrong, but hearing it laid bare. Knowing the bank had deliberately targeted people like her felt like a punch to the gut. She thought of her pension, carefully budgeted each month in the small joys those $50 could have brought. A new book for Jamal, a dinner with her daughter Vivian, a moment of ease in a life that demanded constant vigilance. Mike's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening as he processed Kayla's words. So let me get this straight, he said, his voice slow and deliberate, each word landing like a hammer. You changed your policy to squeeze money out of people who don't have a lot to begin with. People like Mrs. Harris, who've been loyal for decades, and you didn't even bother to tell her? Richard opened his mouth, but no sound came out at first. His face was now a deep shade of red, his tie slightly askew from his nervous fidgeting. It's not targeting, he finally managed, his voice strained. It's standard procedure. The board approved the policy to maintain profitability. Profitability? Mike's voice rose, cutting through Richard's excuse like a blade. He turned to the crowd, holding up Eleanor's bank statement like evidence in a courtroom. You hear that? They're making profits by taking money from people who can least afford it, from folks who trust you to keep their savings safe. He shook his head, his expression a mix of disbelief and disgust. That's not a policy. That's a scam. The crowd erupted into a chorus of voices, louder now, emboldened by Mike's words. That's exactly what they did to me, a man in a work jacket shouted, stepping forward. They hit me with a $20 fee last month. No warning. A woman near the back, clutching a stack of bills, added, My grandma's account got the same thing. She's 83. The room buzzed with anger, phones flashing as more people began recording, their outrage spilling over. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness, but from a swelling sense of validation. She wasn't alone. The fees that had eaten away at her savings weren't just her problem. They were a pattern, a deliberate choice that had hurt others too. She looked at the faces around her, seeing reflections of her own frustration, her own fight. For a moment, she thought of her years as a nurse, comforting patients who felt invisible, and realized she'd become one of them. But now, thanks to Mike, she was being seen. Mike turned back to Richard, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. You got a lot of people here saying the same thing. You gonna keep blaming your system? Or you gonna admit you've been fleecing folks who don't deserve it? Richard's shoulders slumped, his bravado unraveling like a cheap suit. He glanced at Kayla, then at the crowd, then back at Mike, as if searching for an escape. I don't set the policies, he stammered. The corporate office. Then call them, Mike said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He crossed his arms, his massive frame looming over the counter. Right now, get someone on the phone who can explain why you're charging Mrs. Harris and all these people for nothing. Kayla's hands froze over the keyboard, her eyes wide with panic. Richard's face went pale, his lips moving soundlessly as he realized he was trapped. The crowd pressed closer, their voices a rising tide. Call them, the young man with the phone shouted, his camera still rolling. Let's hear it, others echoed, their anger now a unified force. Eleanor watched it all unfold, her heart racing but her mind clear. She thought of her daughter, who'd always told her to fight for what was right, even when it was hard. She thought of her grandson, who looked up to her as a pillar of strength. And she thought of the countless times she'd swallowed her pride to keep the peace. Not today. Today, with Mike Tyson standing beside her, and a room full of strangers finding their voices, she felt unstoppable. Mike leaned closer to Richard, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of a knockout punch. You're running out of excuses, man. And you're running out of time. So what's it gonna be? You gonna fix this, or you gonna keep digging your own grave? Richard swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the phone on the counter. The crowd held its breath, phones raised, waiting for his next move. Kayla looked at Eleanor, her expression a mix of guilt and fear, as if she knew the truth was about to break free. And Eleanor stood tall, her envelope clutched like a shield, ready for whatever came next. The First Trust Bank was no longer just a bank. It was a stage, and every person in the room was now a player in a drama that had spiraled far beyond Richard Baxter's control. The air crackled with tension, the crowd's voices a low hum of outrage and anticipation. Mike Tyson stood like a pillar at the counter, his arms crossed, his piercing gaze locked on Richard, who looked like a man watching his carefully constructed world crumble. Eleanor Harris stood beside Mike, her envelope still clutched tightly, but her eyes shone with a newfound fire. Kayla Thompson behind the counter hovered over the keyboard, her face pale as she glanced between her boss and the sea of phones recording every second of the showdown. Richard's hand hovered over the phone on the counter, his fingers trembling as Mike's words echoed in his ears. Fix this, or keep digging your own grave. The crowd pressed closer, their voices growing louder, more insistent. Call corporate, a man in a construction vest shouted, his phone raised high. Let's hear what they say, a woman with a grocery bag added, her toddler tugging at her sleeve. The young man who'd been recording from the start grinned, his camera steady, the red light a silent promise that this moment would not stay confined to the walls of the bank. Eleanor felt the weight of the room shift, like a tide turning in her favor. She'd come here expecting a simple explanation, maybe an apology at best. Instead, she'd found herself at the center of something bigger, a reckoning, not just for her, but for everyone who'd been quietly bled dry by fees they didn't understand. She glanced at Mike, his presence steadying her like an anchor. He wasn't just fighting for her. He was fighting for fairness, and that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't in years. Richard finally grabbed the phone, his movements jerky, as if he were forcing himself through the motion. Fine, he muttered, his voice barely audible over the crowd's murmurs. I'll call corporate. He punched in a number, his fingers slipping on the keys, and held the receiver to his ear. The room fell into a tense hush, broken only by the faint ringtone emanating from the phone's speaker. Mike tilted his head, his expression unreadable, but his eyes never leaving Richard. Put it on speaker, he said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of a command. We all want to hear this. Richard froze, his face draining of color. That's not necessary. Put it on speaker, Mike repeated, stepping closer to the counter. His voice didn't rise, but it didn't need to. The authority in it was enough to make Richard's hands shake as he fumbled with the phone, pressing a button that filled the room with the sound of ringing. The crowd leaned in, phones raised higher, capturing every detail. Eleanor's heart raced, her mind flashing back to moments in her life when she'd stood up against injustice, against doctors who ignored her expertise, landlords who tried to cheat her, a society that often looked past her. Each time she'd fought alone. But now, with Mike's voice amplifying hers and the crowd's eyes on her, she felt a strength she hadn't known she still had. The call connected, and a crisp female voice came through the speaker. "First Trust Corporate, this is Diane. How can I assist you?" Richard cleared his throat, his voice strained. "Diane, this is Richard Baxter, manager at the Peachtree branch. I need clarification on a customer issue regarding maintenance fees." Before he could finish, Mike leaned forward, his voice cutting through like a blade. "Diane, this is Mike Tyson. I'm standing here with Mrs. Eleanor Harris, a customer for over 40 years, who's been hit with fees she wasn't told about. Your manager's been dodging her questions and disrespecting her in front of everyone. We need answers. Now." A stunned silence followed, both from the phone and the room. Eleanor's eyes widened, a mix of awe and gratitude washing over her. She'd never heard her name spoken with such force, such conviction. The crowd erupted into murmurs, some gasping, others whispering, "He said Mike Tyson." The young man with the phone let out a low whistle, muttering, "This is going viral." On the other end, Diane's voice faltered. "Mr. Tyson, I'm sorry, can you repeat that? You're saying there's an issue with fees?" "You heard me," Mike said, his tone firm but controlled. "Mrs. Harris and a lot of other folks here are getting charged for nothing. No notice, no explanation. Your manager's acting like it's her fault. So tell us, what's going on with these fees?" Richard's face was now ashen, his hand gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles were white. "Diane, it's under control," he interjected, his voice desperate. "It's just a misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding?" Mike said, turning to him with a raised eyebrow. "You call humiliating a 75-year-old lady a misunderstanding? Man, you're in deeper than you think." The crowd laughed, a sharp collective sound that made Richard flinch. Phones chimed throughout the room, notifications popping up as the young man's video began to spread. "It's on Twitter already," someone shouted. 10,000 views already, another voice added. Eleanor blinked, the modern world of social media a blur to her, but she understood enough to know that Richard's actions were no longer his to contain. Kayla, still behind the counter, looked at Eleanor with a flicker of guilt in her eyes. She leaned forward slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mrs. Harris, I'm sorry," she said, so softly only Eleanor could hear. "I didn't know it was like this. I just followed orders." Eleanor studied her for a moment, seeing the conflict in the young woman's face. She remembered being Kayla's age, caught between doing what was right and doing what was expected. "It's not too late to do better," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. Mike caught the exchange and nodded, a small gesture of approval. Then he turned back to the phone, addressing Diane. "So what's it gonna be? You gonna tell us why these fees are hitting people like Mrs. Harris? Or you gonna let this blow up even more?" Diane's voice came through, flustered but professional. "Mr. Tyson, Mrs. Harris, I assure you, will look into this immediately. I'll need to escalate this to our compliance team." "Escalate it now," Mike said, his voice leaving no room for delay. "Because right now your branch manager's making you look real bad." Richard slammed the phone down, cutting off the call. "Enough," he snapped, his voice cracking. "This is my branch, and I won't be interrogated by..." "By who?" Mike interrupted, stepping so close to the counter that Richard instinctively backed away. "By me? By her? By all these people you've been ripping off?" He gestured to the crowd who were now openly cheering, their phones capturing every word. "You're not running this show anymore, man. The truth's coming out, whether you like it or not." The crowd roared, a wave of voices crashing over Richard. "Fix it," a woman shouted. "Give her money back," a man added. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming sense of being heard. She thought of her daughter Vivian, who'd always said, "Mama, you're tougher than anyone I know." She thought of her grandson Jamal, who'd be proud to see her standing tall. And she thought of the patients she'd cared for as a nurse, people who trusted her to fight for them when they couldn't. This was her fight, and now it was theirs too. Mike turned to Eleanor, his voice softening. "Mrs. Harris, you okay?" he asked, his eyes searching hers. She nodded, a small smile breaking through her resolve. "Better than I've been all day," she said, her voice steady. "Thank you." He gave her a nod, a silent acknowledgement of her strength. Then he faced Richard again, his tone hardening. "You heard the lady. She's not going anywhere until this is fixed. And neither are we." He gestured to the crowd, who responded with a chorus of agreement. Phones chimed again, more notifications flooding in. The young man with the camera grinned, holding up his screen. 50,000 views, he shouted. "It's trending." The room buzzed with excitement, the weight of the outside world pressing in on Richard, who looked like a man staring down the barrel of his own mistakes. Eleanor stood tall, her envelope no longer a burden, but a badge of her fight. She didn't know what would happen next, but with Mike Tyson by her side and a crowd finding its voice, she knew one thing for sure. Richard Baxter was out of moves, and the truth was finally free. The First Trust Bank was a cauldron of noise and emotion, the crowd's voices swelling into a chorus of demands that echoed off the glass walls. Mike Tyson stood at the center of it all, his presence a gravitational force, pulling the room's focus toward the counter where Richard Baxter stood, cornered and unraveling. Eleanor Harris clutched her envelope, her heart thumping with a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. The phones raised around her, dozens of tiny red lights blinking, captured every second, their footage already racing across the internet, turning a single woman's fight into a public reckoning. Kayla Thompson behind the counter stared at her screen, her fingers poised as if waiting for permission to act. Richard's face was a mask of defeat, his once polished suit now creased, his tie askew. The phone call with corporate had ended abruptly, Diane's flustered promise to escalate the issue ringing hollow in the charged air. Mike's last words, "You're out of moves," hung over him like a guillotine. The crowd's chants of "fix it" and "give her money back" were relentless, their anger no longer scattered but unified, fueled by Mike's unrelenting pressure and Eleanor's quiet dignity. Mike leaned forward, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "You heard them," he said to Richard, his tone low but unyielding. "Mrs. Harris deserves her money back. So do all these people you've been charging for nothing. What's it going to be?" Richard's eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape that didn't exist. The crowd pressed closer, their phones a silent jury, their voices a rising tide. He opened his mouth, then closed it, his shoulders slumping as the fight drained out of him. "Fine," he muttered, his voice barely audible. He turned to Kayla, his hands shaking as he gestured to the computer. "Do it. Reverse the fees." Kayla blinked, as if unsure she'd heard correctly. "Sir?" "You heard me," Richard snapped, his voice cracking. "Reverse the fees for her account. Now!" Mike raised an eyebrow, his arms still crossed. "Not just her," he said, gesturing to the crowd. "Everyone here who's been hit with these charges. You're fixing it for all of them." The crowd erupted into cheers, a wave of applause and shouts that shook the room. Eleanor felt her breath catch, her eyes stinging with tears she refused to let fall. She looked at the faces around her, men and women, young and old, strangers who'd been silent an hour ago, but were now standing with her. She thought of her years as a nurse, fighting for patients who couldn't fight for themselves, and realized this moment was no different. It was bigger than her, bigger than the $50 a month. It was about dignity, and she wasn't alone in it anymore. Kayla's fingers flew across the keyboard, her face a mix of relief and urgency. The screen flickered as she navigated the system, reversing the fees on Eleanor's account one by one. "It's done," she said after a moment, her voice trembling but clear. "Mrs. Harris, the charges have been refunded. 3 months, $150, back in your account." Eleanor nodded, a small smile breaking through her resolve. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. She turned to Mike, her eyes meeting his. "And thank you, Mr. Tyson. I didn't expect any of this." Mike's face softened, a rare warmth in his eyes. "You didn't need me, Mrs. Harris," he said, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "You were already standing up. I just made sure they listened." The crowd's cheers grew louder as Kayla began processing refunds for others, calling out names and confirming reverse charges. "Mr. Delgado, your $20 fee is gone," she announced, earning a whoop from the man in the work jacket. Ms. Carter, your account's clear, she said to the woman with the toddler, who clapped her hands in delight. Each name was a small victory, a crack in the wall Richard had built. Richard stood frozen, his face a ghostly white. The phone on the counter rang again, the shrill tone cutting through the celebration. Kayla glanced at it, then at Richard, her eyes wide. It's corporate again, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard didn't move. His hands hung limp at his sides, his career flashing before his eyes. Mike stepped back, giving him space but keeping his gaze locked on him. You gonna answer that? He asked, his tone almost casual, but carrying a weight that made Richard flinch. The phone rang once more before Richard grabbed it, his hand shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. This is Baxter, he said, his voice hoarse. The room quieted, straining to hear the muffled voice on the other end. Richard's face fell further with each word, his eyes darting to the floor. Yes, I understand. Effective immediately? He paused, swallowing hard. Yes, ma'am. He hung up slowly, his shoulders sagging as if the air had been sucked out of him. Without looking at anyone, he muttered, I've been relieved of my duties, effective immediately. The words were barely audible, but they landed like a thunderclap. The crowd erupted again, some cheering, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Richard turned and shuffled toward his office, his head bowed, the door slamming behind him with a finality that echoed through the bank. Eleanor watched him go, a mix of satisfaction and weariness settling over her. She'd wanted answers, not someone's downfall, but Richard had chosen his path. She turned to Kayla, who was still processing refunds, her hands moving faster now, as if freed from a weight. You did the right thing, Eleanor said, her voice gentle but firm. Kayla met her eyes, a flicker of gratitude in her expression. I'm sorry, Mrs. Harris, she said, her voice breaking. I should have spoken up sooner. You're speaking now, Eleanor replied, offering a nod. That's what matters. Mike clapped his hands once, a sharp sound that drew the room's attention. That's how it's done, he said, his voice booming with a mix of triumph and defiance. He turned to the crowd, his eyes scanning their faces. Don't ever let anyone make you feel like you don't matter. You stand up, you speak out, and you keep fighting, just like Mrs. Harris did today. The room exploded into applause, phones still recording as the crowd chanted, Mrs. Harris, Mrs. Harris. Eleanor felt her cheeks flush, the weight of their support overwhelming. She'd never been one for attention, but today it felt like a gift, a reminder that her voice, her life still mattered. Mike leaned toward her, his voice low again. You good, ma'am? She smiled, a real smile this time, wide and unguarded. I'm more than good, Mr. Tyson. I'm proud. He nodded, a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. Then without another word, he stepped back, blending into the crowd as if he'd never been the center of it all. The room buzzed with energy, customers lining up to confirm their refunds, their voices a mix of relief and excitement. Eleanor stood still for a moment, letting it all sink in. The envelope in her hands felt lighter now, not a burden, but a victory. As the crowd began to disperse, the young man with the phone approached her, his grin wide. Mrs. Harris, you're a legend, he said, holding up his screen. This video's at 100,000 views already. The world's gonna know your name. Eleanor shook her head, a soft laugh escaping her lips. I don't need the world, she said. I just needed today. But as she glanced at the door where Mike had disappeared, she knew today was only the beginning. The days following the showdown at First Trust Bank passed like a whirlwind, leaving Atlanta and much of the internet buzzing with the story of Eleanor Harris and Mike Tyson. The video, uploaded by the young man in the hoodie, had exploded online, racking up millions of views across platforms. Hashtags like Chobriyi, Justice for Eleanor, and Bankbuster trended for days, with clips of Mike's confrontation and Eleanor's quiet strength shared alongside memes of Richard Baxter's defeated slump. News outlets picked it up, framing it as a David and Goliath tale, a retired nurse and a boxing legend taking on a predatory bank. For Eleanor, it was surreal to see her name in headlines, her face on screens, but it was the quiet moments at home that grounded her. Eleanor sat at her small kitchen table, a cup of chamomile tea steaming in front of her. The morning sun filtered through the curtains, casting soft light on the linoleum floor of her modest apartment. Her phone buzzed incessantly with notifications, messages from neighbors, calls from reporters, even a text from her grandson Jamal that read, "Grandma, you're a superhero." She smiled, setting the phone face down. She wasn't one for fame, but the pride in Jamal's words warmed her more than the tea ever could. The bank had moved quickly to contain the damage. By Monday, First Trust's corporate office issued a public statement, printed in bold on their website and plastered across their social media. "We deeply regret the distress caused to our customers and are conducting a full review of our fee policies. All affected accounts have been refunded, and we are committed to greater transparency moving forward." The statement didn't mention Richard Baxter, but a follow-up article in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution confirmed he'd been fired, with sources citing gross mismanagement and failure to uphold company values. Kayla Thompson, the young teller, had been placed on probation but kept her job after providing a detailed account of Richard's pressure to enforce the fees without question. Eleanor sipped her tea, her mind drifting back to the bank. She'd returned the day after the incident to confirm her refund, finding the branch quieter, the staff subdued. Kayla had greeted her with a nervous smile, handing her a printed statement showing the $150 restored to her account. "We're making things right, Mrs. Harris," she'd said, her voice earnest. Eleanor had nodded, sensing the girl's sincerity. Change, she knew, started small, sometimes with a single person choosing to do better. The impact went beyond the bank. The video had sparked a wave of stories online, customers from other branches and even other banks sharing their own experiences with unexpected fees. A local activist group launched a petition for stricter regulations on banking practices, gaining thousands of signatures overnight. Eleanor's name became a rallying cry, her image, a 75-year-old Black woman standing tall with an envelope in hand, shared as a symbol of resilience. She didn't seek the spotlight, but when a reporter called to ask about her role, she said simply, "I just wanted what was mine, but if my fight helps others, then it's worth it." At home, her daughter Vivian visited that evening, bringing Jamal along. They sat in the living room, the TV muted, as Vivian recounted how her co-workers wouldn't stop talking about the video. "Mama, you're famous," she said, her eyes shining with pride. "I always knew you were tough, but this is next level." Jamal, sprawled on the couch with his sneakers dangling over the armrest, grinned. "Grandma, you and Mike Tyson? That's epic. Did he, threaten to knock the guy out?" Eleanor laughed, a sound that felt lighter than it had in weeks. "No, baby," she said, ruffling his hair. "He didn't need to. His words were enough." But the truth was, Mike's presence had been more than words. It was the way he looked at her, like she mattered, like her fight was worth his time. She thought of him often, wondering what had driven him to step into her battle. She didn't know much about his life beyond the headlines, his victories, his struggles, his redemption. But she sensed a kindred spirit, someone who'd fought his own wars and come out stronger. The community felt it too. At the grocery store, strangers stopped her to shake her hand, calling her the bank lady with warm smiles. At church on Sunday, the pastor mentioned her in his sermon, praising her courage as an example of standing firm in faith. Eleanor blushed through it all, unused to the attention, but grateful for the connection it fostered. She'd always believed in community. Her years as a nurse had taught her that. But now she felt it wrapping around her like a quilt, each stitch a person who'd seen her fight and chosen to stand with her. One evening, as she sorted through a pile of mail, letters from supporters, flyers from local groups, she found an envelope that stopped her cold. It was plain, postmarked from Las Vegas, with no return address. Her hands trembled as she opened it, pulling out a single sheet of paper and a small card. The handwriting was bold, slightly uneven, but clear. "Mrs. Harris, you reminded me what strength looks like. Keep fighting, Mike." Tucked inside was an invitation to a charity event in Atlanta, hosted by Mike Tyson to support financial literacy for seniors and low-income families. Eleanor's breath caught, her fingers tracing the words. She'd never expected to hear from him again, yet here he was, reaching out across the distance to remind her she wasn't forgotten. She set the letter down, her tea long cold, and looked out the window at the city lights twinkling against the dusk. The world wasn't perfect. Banks would still scheme, people would still struggle. But for the first time in a long time, Eleanor felt like she'd left a mark. She wasn't just a retired nurse living paycheck to paycheck. She was Eleanor Harris, the woman who'd stood up and the world had listened.